Thanks very much indeed. Uh, it obviously gives me great pleasure to be here uh, this morning, and a special tribute to my good friend Karl. I was not able to be here yesterday evening when, on Wednesday evening as well, certainly not yesterday, when several people paid more formal tribute to Professor Theodore. I'm sure that all the things that could have been said have been said already, but as once I heard a famous politician said, everything that can have been said on this topic has been said already, but not everyone has said them, and then proceeded to say them. So if some of the comments I make about Karl have been made before, I hope you will forgive me for being repetitive. But in the person of the distinction of Karl, one cannot be too repetitive in terms of the good things he has done. Jose Marti, who was the guru of the Cuban independence, made a famous statement that every man in his life must do three things. He must plant a tree, he must write a book, and he must have a son. I asked about whether Karl had any sons, and I was told, as far as we know, he only has one. We're going to come back to the sons Karl has had in a minute. But in terms of planting a tree, Karl has not really planted a tree. What he's done is done something more substantial than plant a tree. He has founded an institute. In 1995, when the Health Economics Unit was born, that in a sense was the seed of the tree that has sprouted to form the Health Economic Center, whose work has spread in this way, in the same way the branches of a tree has spread, whose work has influence has spread all over the Caribbean. But in the context of a tree, what that institute has done is not only have branches, but it has planted its roots firmly in the development scene of the Caribbean. And we have to be grateful to Karl for the tree that he has planted, for the roots that it has developed, and for the branches it has spread. In terms of writing a book, Karl has not written one book. He has done more than that. He has dedicated his tremendous intellectual capacity to developing the kinds of work, in a sense, is probably more important than a single book. Because what he has done is to use his talent to spread the word of health and what health means all over the Caribbean. And that word has been received with acclamation by individuals, by intellectuals, by governments, and has been used by governments all over the Caribbean. I can't speak in detail over Karl's capacity as an economist, because much of his econometrics I really don't understand. I don't understand much of mathematics. I never did calculus in school, so that part of it I don't understand. But essential parts of it I really do understand. I first came into contact with that intellectual output of Karl in 1991 when Alistair McIntyre and Louis Emery from the IDB came here to Trinidad to talk about what are some of the development problems of Trinidad and Tobago. And Karl's seminal contribution to that discussion was well recognized not only by Karl and ourselves, but also by Alistair and the report that was subsequently presented to government. And then it was in the year 2000 when the AIDS epidemic, which Eddie will remember very well, was in its heyday. Can I use the word epidemic in its heyday? Well, AIDS epidemic was devastating or threatened to devastate the Caribbean. Karl produced some seminal work which convinced the heads of government that the economic ravages of AIDS would be so great that it behoved them then to dedicate considerable attention to the problem of HIV. And his work was one of the important ingredients in having the World Bank, for example, to dedicate considerable resources to the problem of AIDS in the Caribbean and convincing the Caribbean people, the Caribbean heads of government no less, that it was important to address the issue of AIDS. And then 2001, I had the opportunity to work with Karl when we had the Commission on Macroeconomics and Health. I happen to be co-chair of the working group to deal with the relationship between health, poverty reduction, and economic growth. And Karl made a major contribution to that group. And during that discussion, Karl would always remind me of the famous dictum of Adam Smith in 1776, who wrote, and I can read what Adam Smith said: "The annual produce of the land and labor of any nation can be increased in its value by no other means but by increasing either the number of its productive laborers or the productive power of those laborers who had before been employed." And Karl would point out that the essence of the productivity of those laborers lay in their health. And Karl would point out that you should view health not only in terms of the flow of health, but view health in terms of the stock, as the economists say. And that stock of health really has three dimensions. It has the dimension of the quality of life. The quality of life is being a part of that stock of health. And when we speak of the quality of life in terms of being a stock of health, we think of that stock of health as being one of the intrinsic or constitutive aspects of health. We can think of the stock of health also in terms of productivity, the instrumental aspect of health. And we can think in terms of the longevity which combines both the constitutive or intrinsic aspect as well as the instrumental aspect. And Karl's contribution to that debate, he wrote a paper on the relationship of AIDS into productivity in the Caribbean, which formed a very intrinsic part of that final report. Then in 2002, when we had the Commission on Health and Development of the Caribbean, Karl was again a contributor. Karl, C.Y. Lewis, Stanley Lalter, Roger McLean, all contributors to that publication. And that publication, Health and Development of the Caribbean, which in a sense was stirred and stimulated by comments I had made to Compton Bourne before, that in his description of the development of the Caribbean, we agreed that health was one of the constituents that could have been dealt with more extensively. And we've since come to agree that that concept of health as stock rather than flow is so important in describing what health would do. So I said Karl planted a tree. We have seen its branches grow, we've seen its roots grow deeper. He has written not a book, but he has produced material which is, in a sense, better than a book. And although he has one biological son, he's had many more academic sons and daughters. And perhaps that is one of the great tributes to Karl, to his production of his tutelage of his economic intellectual sons and daughters. And as those intellectual sons and daughters, many of whom are here today, will carry on the work that Karl has done, it will continue to spread the message that it is important that the people of the Caribbean pay attention to their health for the reasons I have mentioned. So if it would seem that this is a eulogy, it is a eulogy. But eulogies are not only when people die. Eulogies are for when people are alive, that they can hear what good things we say about them. So in that context, it is my great pleasure to have had these few opportunities to say some of the things that I think about Karl and to give an idea of the esteem in which I hold him. Thank you. Thanks so much. Now, we proceed to the armchair part of the session. And in discussion, my colleagues, initially one thought of having each one of them give a 8 or 10 minute presentation. We thought that would be terribly boring. So what we thought we would do, we would restrict that formal part to a couple of minutes and then have more of an interactive discussion. The title of it is Health in Terms of the Development of the Caribbean, the Role of the Institutions. And I'm going to give my preference for not using the term development without any qualification, because I've always made the comment that use the word development without qualification is contextually, it is negative, it is neutral, it is empty, contextually empty. One should always qualify what kind of development one is talking about. So I prefer the aspect of human development. And I think not because I am by nature anthropocentric, but I believe it is a better definition of what development we are speaking about. And I think that there's been general consensus that human development has three basic it used to be called pillars, but I prefer not pillars, which tend to stand in isolation. But I like to think of them as a helix in helical form, that these three strands that support the sustainability of human development are the social, economic, and environmental strands. It's the interlinkage of these three strands that sustains and makes human development appropriate. And health in that context is not only an indicator of human development, but health is a component of that social strand which in helical form sustains human development. So the question I'm going to put to our distinguished colleagues is this: if you see health in that context as being one of the intricate parts of the strand, the social strand that supports human development, and you see it also as a component of that human development, I'm going to put to them the questions. I gave them the questions beforehand, so in a sense, they know the questions beforehand. The three institutions that you represent, we have three important regional institutions. We have the university. We have, I think Eddie would claim that, I would claim that Eddie represents CARICOM. Having lived and worked in CARICOM for so long, I think he is empowered to speak on behalf of CARICOM. And then we have James Hospedales from the Caribbean Public Health Agency. The only agency of equal importance we don't have is the Caribbean Development Bank. We have his esteemed ex-president here who can really comment on that aspect of it. I asked him these two basic questions. Given the role of the institution, given the remit of the institution you represent, how do you see health as, how would your institution look on enhancing health as a component of that human development? And also, in a related sense, how will you see health facilitating the interaction of health with the other two strands of human development, the environmental and the economic? So, can health be enhanced as a component of human development? And can health strengthen the sustainability of that human development? Having said that, Jeff Sachs just published a huge tome on sustainable development, and he would add as an underlying or supporting these three components, aspect of governance. We debate that whether governance should be seen as one of the intrinsic components or whether governance is seen as facilitating these three components acting together. But that is probably for the discussion. So I'm going to begin with Karl, if you don't mind, Karl, and ask, from their point of view, how would you react to those two questions?
Yeah, I was just saying the mission statement of the university has a line which says that the university, part of its mission is to boost or to contribute to the development of the countries of this region. And you know, I have always taken that very literally. And I'm saying that if we accept that, we have always accepted in this region that health is a contributor to our development. You look at all of our development plans, and health has always had an important part in it. I think the responsibility of the university to contribute to better health systems in the region, then to me is really one that is very strong. It is in that context, and I know we're talking about the university and not the Center for Health Economics per se, but it is in that context that the Center for Health Economics has seen its work. You know, one of the mission statement of the Department of Economics has a line in it, which is also a very interesting line. It says that the department wants to see itself in the corner of these countries. And I think that is what the HU has always said. The HU has always thought that what we have to begin with is a recognition that these countries do have serious problems. And that we as a university, although we know as a university, one of our functions is to advance knowledge and research and to publish and so on. But in the Caribbean context, to me, it has always seemed to me that one of the important things of this university must be that we really go we be seen in the corner of these countries and become intimately involved in their work. Now, one of my regrets, if I have to say that, is that I've always dreamed of a situation where when countries in this region have problems and they're looking at these problems, I've always thought that one of the agencies or one of the institutions that they always know that will be there or they could call on to help them would be UE. And I don't know if that is true in a number of areas. It's probably true in some areas, but I think it can certainly be true in more. And I think there is a sense in which we in the university have to create a balance, a much better balance between the research output that we know we have to put out and the contributions we're making to countries as they set about solving problems. Now, I know we are doing this on one level. We are training people, and those people are going out and working in these countries. But again, we have to be careful here. The training is not a question of numbers. The training has to be the quality of that training. And we have to make sure with the way we train our graduates that when they go out, they can, in fact, contribute in the way that we expect them and want them. So in a way, we have to continually be looking at our training within the university to ensure that the training remains relevant to the countries and the countries' problem. So I think that's the first thing I think the second main thing I think we have to do as universities recognize that as a region, it's not part of our culture to really record things, and it's certainly not part of our culture in making our decisions to use in the data and information to guide what we are doing. And I think one of the things the university can do is to help to change that culture here. We have to become countries where we know whenever we're making decisions, we have to be informed by evidence. We have to be informed by information that has been collected on the problem and by the kind of and the analyses that have been done. So research and information that is problem to solve problems. I think that we could play a greater role to help the countries to know that as they move to make important decisions, they know what kind of information they must have before they make those decisions. They know what kind of research must be necessary before they move ahead. So okay. I think those two things are the two main things, I think. Make sure that we train our people in a way that we have an attitude that we're in there with these countries, helping them at every level, at every stage with solving their problems. And the second thing is to try to build a culture where the decision-making that goes on in the Caribbean from here on is decision-making that is based on data, on information that we collect.
And you would contend, I could come back to that again, come back to question you, what is the particular pertinence of health to these two criteria that you set up? And I come back to that again. The criteria, how do you see health in the context of the two criteria you set up? I want to come back to that. Eddie?
Thank you. Sorry. You took off yours?
Oh, sorry.
Thank you, Sir George. I'm in an ambivalent position because having left the official rankings of CARICOM in the Secretariat a few years ago, I can't speak authoritatively, but I could speak with commitment and passion about the regional program and the regional institution called CARICOM. But also in my role as representative of the Secretary General of the UN, I want to frame this opening statement in the context of both the UN system and CARICOM, because they are interrelated with what Sir George really pronounced as human development. As we heard yesterday, we have just, in the UN system, proclaimed the Sustainable Development Goals, 2030 Sustainable Development Goals, based on poverty, reducing poverty, environmental sustainability, as well as placing emphasis on people. And so when we talk about the connection between the global and the regional system, it's important that we recognize that what just happened last week at the UN General Assembly, when 192 countries committed to the Sustainable Development Goals, it was a commitment to development, financing, and global cooperation on the delivery of these goals, one of which is health. But the goals are so framed that health relates to about 12 of the other 17 goals. And so it's important to note that we are operating and discussing in the context of the dynamics of a global environment in which sustainable development is a critical component. But having said that, I believe that there are two fundamental considerations that I would want to put forward. One is that when we look at this period about Caribbean's response to the Millennium Development Goals, which is an important benchmark for human development, of which Sir George referred, that we have made considerable progress in the Caribbean on most of these. And what this shows is that the MDGs played a very important role in the institutional responses that we had in the region. Let me give you an example that we've produced considerable gains with respect to poverty reduction in the Caribbean. And I just want to point out to a really important document by PAHO, which was released, and it's on the PAHO website for those students and others here, which really I wouldn't go into because I don't have the time, but it shows the progress that we have made on each of these. But what I want to really connect up with is not only the progress, but those institutions of the Caribbean and CARICOM that help to make the difference. So reducing poverty, I would say that UNDP was very critical in collaboration with the CARICOM Secretariat in pushing this agenda for the reduction of poverty. The other one, attracting significant improvements in the provision of basic services like health, like education, like sanitation. And here, for example, PAHO becomes a very important player. And so too is an instrument which we underestimate, which is an institutional capability, reference point, the Caribbean Cooperation and Health, to which all Caribbean countries, including the agencies, including the Caribbean Center for Health Economics, subscribe. And also CARFA is perhaps epitomizes, when perhaps the director speaks, the implementation of the Caribbean Cooperation in Health. Now there's another important gain from the MDGs that connect up with human development, and it has to do with directing attention to the region's environmental vulnerabilities. Important, because those vulnerabilities are about disaster preparedness. And here we have the Caribbean Development Catastrophic Fund, which is there organized by CARICOM in order to assist countries to help to reestablish themselves after national disaster. We have the CDB dealing with readiness to help invest in the rehabilitation. And we have SEDEMA, which is the Caribbean Environmental Management Agency, which is the pinnacle, so to speak, of the coordination of disaster response. We have medical disasters like Ebola, which emerged and caused a panic in connection with our tourism industry in particular, and dengue and chikungunya. And what we had, a response by CARFA, another institution of CARICOM, responding immediately and setting the agenda and the templates. And then we have social, connecting with what Sir George said, social disasters in this region, crime, teenage pregnancies, and drugs, the relationship between drugs and our economy. And we have agencies set up by CARICOM that has that have been anchoring the responses. Impacts located in Trinidad. The Implementation Agency for Crime and Security in the Caribbean, located in Trinidad and Tobago. We have the recently established steering committee led by the first ministers and CARICOM and UNFPA, called Every Woman, Every Child, intended to deal with the crises related to pregnancies, women's and adolescents' health. Now, I don't have time to go into detail, but hopefully you have a flavor of what the institutions of CARICOM bring in response to the global challenges of sustainable development.
Thank you very much, Eddie. And I was so pleased to hear you refer to the institutions of the Caribbean and not CARICOM as some Spanish call it intelequia, as some sort of distant, vacant, vacuous entity. That you speak of CARICOM in terms of its institutions. And when you come back, I'm going to ask you to, how do you see one of the pillars of those institutional arrangements, which is functional cooperation, contributing to the health, which you point out is so absolutely critical and is so related to the work of these various institutions. I'm going to ask you to come back to comment on that. James.
Thank you, Sir George. Good morning, all.
Morning.
Professor Theodore and Eddie. In the few minutes to start us off, I want to make 3 points. I want to look back briefly at how health has contributed and been intertwined with sustainable development. I want to reflect that CARFA, the Caribbean Public Health Agency, is the latest expression of that cooperation. And I want to then look at what the role of the agency will be going forward in the next 10 to 15 years, coincident with the time frame of the SDGs. And I accept that health and education are the two major drivers of social capital, which together with a healthy environment form the basis for the economy. Without a healthy environment, without health as a resource for living, economics does not work. And I see Compton over there as a banking sort of person. I believe that CARFA going forward really can make a big difference to the human, the economic, and the environmental development of our region. In other words, the sustainable development of our region. If we look back, how many people here are under the age of 25? Under the age of 25. Yes. So none of you would ever have seen a case of measles in your life. Prior to that, we had about 20,000 a year. Several hundred deaths and lots of hospitalizations. In what was called CCH1, this region eliminated measles, being the first in the world to do so. And that benefit accrues year after year. And we've maintained it ever since. In what was called CCH2, there was a massive scale-up in the response to HIV and AIDS. And in what's called CCH3, Caribbean Corporation Health Phase 3, in which we're now coming to an end, we saw the Caribbean elevating non-communicable disease to the global development agenda. The first time such small countries had grabbed the attention of the UN. I wrote a piece for the G7 Brussels magazine a few months ago in June, pointing out how we had punched above our weight in taking some of these issues on, eliminating measles, first in the world to do so, taking NCDs to the global development agenda. And all of these leverage regional institutions. They leverage the former CAREC, CFNI, UWI, with the data that they had, the connections that they've had. What has now happened is that in 2011, the heads of government of the Caribbean brought those together and created a single new powerful umbrella, the Caribbean Public Health Agency, as the principal expression, the principal instrument of Caribbean cooperation in health. And we face a different future. I think it was Stalin who said, our people's facing its darkest hour. Our region now needs CARFA more than ever. But we have a major demographic shift on the way, which makes healthy aging an economic imperative, not just, or else health costs will outstrip pension costs down the line. We have the non-communicable diseases and childhood obesity. No country in the world has turned around an obesity epidemic at national level. That gives you pause. when no country has succeeded in doing something. We have an obesogenic environment. We're so dependent on trade for our food. We have, with the aging comes increased burden of dementia. We have violence and injuries. 2 of the top 10 suicide rates in the world are in the Caribbean. And 3 or 4 of the highest top 10 homicide rates in the world are in the Caribbean. So we've developed and we have middle income and upper middle income. But something's wrong still with our social development and the inequity. And we have climate change. And I would posit that climate change and NCDs are 2 sides of the same coin, failures of our development paradigm. We're over-consuming fossil fuels, alcohol, food, tobacco, and those things are driving these huge problems that we face. So CARFA is now a principal instrument of CCH, a single umbrella integrating, supposed to create more synergy, and its role is to catalyze change in the member states to address some of these problems, to achieve regional health security, given our tourism industry, to tackle the NCDs, particularly through public policy to change the environment. And we are on track to do a program of work with the Council for Trade and Economic Development, because much of the action is outside of the health sector that is needed. To tackle violence and injury prevention, there's one single measure that cuts right across violence, that cuts right across all injuries, all NCDs, it's alcohol control. We have a love-hate relationship with the Caribbean with it, but the harmful use of alcohol is really a huge burden. And the environment and climate change. We also have weak regulatory systems. Just last week, the Council of Human and Social Development indicated the path by which CARFA would be the competent community institution to regulate pharmaceuticals, register and regulate pharmaceuticals in the region. I think with those kinds of approaches, we have the chance to decrease mortality, premature mortality from non-communicable disease and injury in line with the MDGs, 30% by 2030. I think we can cut the rate of childhood obesity in half and surpass the goal that's been set globally, because WHO has said we want to halt it by 2025. That means accepting current levels. I don't accept that. The Caribbean has always been able to punch above its weight. I think we can improve productivity. If you think that in this country, NCDs take out 8% of the GDP, if we can address that, you improve productivity and you decrease the upward cost spiral in health, and you decrease the costs to employers. So in brief, that's, Sir George, the way forward. I think a final point would be how important it is to embrace partnership approaches, whole of society approaches, to be able to achieve some of the above.
Thank you very much, James. I like your set out. It may sound grim, but it's a realistic litany of some of the health problems that we face. And your confidence that the Caribbean has within its institutions to address the problem and to be a leader in the world as to how these problems might be addressed. I'm going to come back to you later on in terms of how do you see the countries as a whole responding to this leadership, to provide the leadership that was once provided in terms of the NCDs in moving the agenda forward. What would be the secret of it, and what would be the secret of getting our countries really to accept that health does have a place to play in solving some of the problems that you mentioned? And that is a segue into the comment I made to Karl. Karl, you speak of the university as a whole, but university, in a sense, is a concept, a construct that is made up of, in itself, of its own institutions. Do you see that the possibility of the various parts of the university being added at one over this vision of yours of health being, of the institution being contributing to the health of the region and thus contributing to human development? What are the institutional constraints? What are the various parts of the institution that you think need to be galvanized in order to do this?
That's a big one.
I know.
I think my approach is a little different. I would say that in recognizing that the university as a whole should be moving forward in a certain direction, I would also recognize the difficulty in getting that movement as an aggregate push. So my attitude is to identify institutions within the university and see if we could get them to start moving in that direction, and then hopefully the others will
follow.
Will go that. So, and that's why the work we are doing in the center, that is what we, in fact, we don't want to embarrass people, but we always say that we hope that the rest of the university takes the approach that the HU takes in coming to grips with the actual problems in countries and working with them to find solutions. That approach is what we take in the HU, and we really hope that other parts of the university will really take it.
Let me agree with you. And let me say that for the purpose only of this discussion, let me take the point of view that James made, that if, in fact, in the Caribbean, if we are going to move forward, health and education have to be sort of the batteries or the instruments or whatever you like it for us. If you take that view, there are parts of the institution then that would play a role in this movement towards better health. Not only the health sector, not only the faculty of medicine, but the other parts of the institution that would do it. Can you see that happening? How does one get health then to be a part of that goal of helping countries to deal with their problems? Let's say that we agree that health is an important problem in all of our countries, health and education in all of our countries. How do you see other parts of the university recognizing that as their North Star?
It's interesting you say that. Yesterday we heard a presentation from Professor Hutchinson, where he detailed for us this sort of mental health picture in this region. And it is really, it is a frightening picture. And I sat thinking, but if that's going on, what is UE doing? Mm-hmm. I mean, we have a situation where that is happening, and the university is not seen or known to be doing something. So I would suggest, in fact, that people like Prof Hutchinson should be required, or should some effort should be made to get them to link more closely with individual country situations and with him and his graduate students. So this is what we did with the HU. The HU started with myself and with my graduate students, and I think that's what other people could do with lecturers here, with researchers within the university and their graduate students. They go to different countries and start working with them, and I think mental health is definitely one of the areas I would love to see some kind of movement.
I'm going to put another thesis to you in a minute. Eddie, I said you're one of the great proponents of this idea that cooperation in functional areas, or functional cooperation is a better aspect, is one of the areas in which CARICOM should be a major protagonist. Given the number of institutions that you mentioned, how do you see them rallying around this idea of functional cooperation for health?
I think that functional cooperation is a critical component, and I have to perhaps set the stage for that. A critical component, it's a critical component of establishing the value and viability of regional integration. Because very often, what happens is that we judge the performance of CARICOM as a regional body only on the performance of its single market and economy, which is really a very, very difficult road to go down, but very important in the future. And especially when we look at the fact that long-term growth in the Caribbean has been really very poor. Let me take out the very. It has been poor when you compare it with Southeast Asia. I mean, our general economic growth rate over a period of, since the 1970s, according to the data, is 2%, compared with 8% in Southeast Asia and Asia, and 6% in Africa. So, in fact, sustainability for health and other things must necessarily be compromised if we are depending solely on generating it from our economic growth prospect. But there is a solution. There is an option that we have, which is an option by pursuing cooperation in a functional way, functional cooperation. We did it for health, and as I think James said, and as a result of cooperating with PAHO, functionally and with all the CARICOM states, we eliminated polio and smallpox. And we plan to do that for HIV. We plan to do that for HIV. But now, why to come more directly to what you asked? It seems to me that when we think of functional cooperation, it's not only about health and education, but it is aligned with education and health in relation to tourism, health in relation to food production and of agricultural policy, health in relation to the way that we deal with our environment. So that, in fact, you don't see the thing in silo, but functional cooperation is the way that countries come together to deliver on special things, including tourism, agriculture, the environment, but in particular, health and education. Mm-hmm. And this is what CARICOM really has been strong on doing. And I want to connect up with Karl, what Karl said. In recent times, the institutions of CARICOM have depended a lot on the capacity and capability of the University of the West Indies. The Caribbean Corporation, the Caribbean Climate Change Center, which is located in Belize, has drawn heavily on CERMES and the Faculty of Sciences throughout the West Indies. And if you look at, for example, other areas in the context of how we deal with our work, our collaboration between the university and dealing with our response to the monetary program, which Professor Bourne led for many years, is a vital resource. So, Sir George, without even answering the question only on health, I've tried to demonstrate how, by working in the area of functional cooperation, the Caribbean could generate growth and sustainable development on a series of things, including health, including education, and the other areas. But lastly, I want to pay a compliment to the Center for Health Economics. Recently, when we were struggling with how we will make the case for strengthening our capability to invest in HIV in the sustainable development era, we asked the Health Economics Unit to come up with some indicators. And they came up with a study on dependence, the dependency study of the Caribbean on external agencies. And it tells a story. It tells the story that the Caribbean overall is highly dependent on overseas assistance for its health response and its HIV response. That cannot be sustainable development, Sir George. Mm-hmm. And we have to take that seriously as to how we revive the way that we deal with our investments in health.
James, as I said before, you gave a litany of these health problems. And as your institution, there has to be some way of bringing them together. There has to be some common thread that goes through them. Could you trace that common thread that goes through them, then to give some idea of what would be the appropriate public health response? Is there some common thread that goes through these litany of problems that you mentioned? And how would you see CARFA dealing with them? The litany of health problems that you mentioned, not other problems that you mentioned. And how would you see that CARFA deal with them in a coordinated way?
Thank you, Sir George. I think the litany of health problems is against a background of a lot of progress, but we face a lot of challenges in health and in environment with climate change as an existential threat. I think CARFA represents the beginning of CCH4, and it is beginning one is beginning to see that the health ministers and beyond the health ministers, I think recognizing that in these issues, these threats to health, we have a threat to sustainable development that we need to address. We are addressing, we as CARFA fit into the CARICOM strategic plan in the social cluster of institutions, in the environmental cluster, and in the security cluster. One of the ways I think that we need to, in changing and going forward, is we need to quote unquote go retail. The institutions have been too distant from people. And one of the ways to go retail is with these things. We have more of these in the community of the Caribbean than people. Trinidad and Tobago has 2 million cell phone units and 1.3 million people. There are only 2 cell phone companies with whom to negotiate. Denmark, which has 5 million people, has 128 cell phone companies. We have 17 million people, including Haiti, and 2 cell phone companies. Something's wrong there. It's a duopoly, but set that aside. It's a great opportunity for strategic alliances to engage people in a new way, for collecting information, for advocating, for engaging civil society, for mobilizing resources. We must have investment to be able to implement some of the cost-effective, very cost-effective measures. The estimated return on investment of CARFA's work by Health Economics Unit is 23 to 1. Compton, I hope you still have some lines to the bank to tell them estimated return on investment of the kind of work that we do is 23 to 1. That's a very good, and why is that? Because work in the areas of tobacco control, of water and sanitation, of healthier, changing the food environment has big payoff. So I think part of the way going forward is we have to be much more engaging. Secondly, beside people, and again through the CARICOM system, really engaging with the other sectors in a new way. With transportation. Now, why should transportation pay attention? I sat in a meeting of the Regional Committee for Climate Change with people from transport, and I tried to talk about health, and they said, we don't do health. So I reframed the argument. I said, let's talk about mitigating climate change through promoting alternative transportation like biking and walking and rapid mass transport. Oh, you have something to say about mitigating climate change? Yes. Promoting alternative transportation like biking and walking. It's good for health, it's good for energy security, and it's good for the climate. Suddenly you have an audience. This is straight out of Philippians 2:4. Seek ye not your own interest, but look also to the interests of others. It doesn't say don't pay attention to your interest, but we have to balance our advocacy with listening and reframing the arguments that we have. Removing preventable impediments to economic growth. If NCDs are taking out 5 to 8% of the GDP of Jamaica, Barbados, and Trinidad and Tobago, and it is mostly preventable, we have to engage in a different kind of dialogue, removing preventable impediments to economic growth. Not tackling NCDs, that's the symptoms. Let's deal with the kinds of fiscal measures, properly taxing tobacco, alcohol, and sodas, and redirecting some of that money into educating people. Let's look at cross-subsidies for fruits and vegetables and fiscal incentives for the agriculture sector. Let's look, as I was saying earlier, at transportation, how to promote biking and walking, and so on and so forth.
Okay, good, thanks. Before I go to the audience, let me, all of you, you three of you have answered brilliantly, I think, the first part of the question, how enhancing health is a component of development. But in terms of facilitating the interaction, let me suggest a general thesis, which I think has perhaps not been explicit, but implicit in much of what you said. You speak of the various parts of the university. You spoke of the various parts of CARICOM. You spoke of the various parts of the community. All of those speak to the issue of the cooperation between sectors, between institutions. And let me use something with which we've spoken, James, as a poster child for this, the whole issue of childhood obesity, which is probably the biggest, if not one of the biggest public health problems the Caribbean faces. Caribbean children are getting fatter and fatter and fatter every day. Fatter and fatter and fatter. I use 3 fatters every day to emphasize it. And that, the solution of that, in a sense, will be a poster child for some of the things you all 3 have spoken about. And I put it to you, Karl, that there would be institutions in the Caribbean, in the university, that so far have given no attention to this issue. Your law colleagues have not thought of the issue in terms of human rights. Your social colleagues have not thought of it in terms of how you present the data necessary. And I put it to you, Eddie, many of the institutions in the Caribbean that have done fantastic work in their area have not thought of this as an area of possible work. And I'll put it to you, James. Well, I know, James, you're a convert to this. In terms of the various parts of the agents which you deal, there's not been this synthesis of thought directed towards what has to be one of the big problems of our time. And before I go to the audience, let me put it to you this way, that many of you spoke of health as a consequence, Eddie, but a consequence of the diminished economic growth. And we're going to spin it and say, could it be the other way around?
Yes.
That it could be, and we have not really thought of this.
Sure.
And in our discussion in the Caribbean, there always is the idea of health being intrinsic in terms of, like what I was saying earlier, in terms of the stock rather than the flow, of the intrinsic value of health.
Sure.
And there's been reluctance, almost a religious reluctance to think of it in instrumental terms. But now, let's hear some comments from our audience. We have half an hour. Yes, please. Now, I'm going to ask you your comments short, your speeches to the point, and don't become a fourth panelist. Yes, let's start with the lady. I can't hear you.
It's coming.
Help is on the way. Yes.
Good morning.
Morning.
A number of comments. Well,
Yes,
my name-
come closer to the mic. I mean, at my age, we don't hear very well.
Okay. Is this any better?
Yeah.
Okay. My name is Dr. Nora Cordner, and I have a number of comments
Still not hearing.
and hopefully a question. Mr. Hospedales quoted.
I can't hear you, lady. You know.
Okay, Mr. Hospedales quoted some scripture in his presentation, and I wanted him
Ephesians.
to ask him to inquire about, in terms of the institutions of CARICOM, there's been an attempt to include faith communities through some interfaith activity. And if he could speak to that, and how is that being engaged, how the faith communities in the region are being engaged to redirect our thinking about issues like health and climate change.
Okay, good.
In terms of the matter of external funding to address some of our social needs, we have a situation in the region, but specifically here in Trinidad and Tobago, where we are relying on external funding to address heritage and legacy issues. And if we are to begin to think about matters of self-investment in the area of heritage and legacy and health, that we would be better served by investing from ourselves in these things, because external investment is not a
Okay.
sustainable option.
Thanks very much.
And the last one would be on the issue of, could we reframe health not so much as a human right, but as a basic need, which would take us closer to the community. When we think of basic needs in terms of food, clothing, shelter, and healthcare, or access to healthcare, it is a closer connect, because oftentimes human rights sounds very intellectual and very academic, but basic needs is more inclusive.
Thanks very much. I'm going to take 2 rounds of these because there are 3 questions, very important questions. Let's go over here first.
My name is Brendan Bain, retired professor of community health from the Mona campus.
Come close to the mic too, Brendan, so I can hear you better.
I want to just ask 2 questions. What is our working definition of health? Is the conscious and subconscious focus on the physical? How much real emphasis do we place on mental and social health, as Professor Hutchinson did in his presentation yesterday? Or do we keep coming back to the physical only? I think I hear that in Singapore they teach children about EQ from primary school. Please check me on that. see if that's correct.
Explain what you mean by EQ, James Coleman's definition.
Emotional quotient, not just intellectual quotient. So that's my first question in a package, is do we come back to physical every time we think about health? The second question is, do the job descriptions of university staff and the expectations include the kind of linkages that you spoke about, Professor Theodore? I found that when I was working in the Caribbean, spending a lot of time outside the university for the last 10 years, people in the university thought I was strange.
Good. I think we take those two first. And I'm going to ask you to reflect on those, because I know Eddie will have something to say about the second point about the faith-based organizations in health. James, you want to comment on that? I would take the point, though, he was talking about institutions of the agency. Yes, go ahead. Institutions of the region. Yes, go ahead, James. You want to? Eddie, why don't you begin?
Okay. Sorry. I would just respond to the issue of faith institutions, faith communities, with respect to the response to HIV and AIDS. We have had, as you know, in this region, some pushback from one of the goals of getting to the end of AIDS. And one of the goals would be to eliminate HIV-related stigma and discrimination. And without going into detail, much of the faith organizations, although there are 15 elements to that, one of which is modifying or eliminating punitive laws. The faith organizations, some of them see the thrust only in terms of that one of the 15 elements. And so we've had to work closely with engagement with the faith institutions. And what we have discovered is that we are on the same page, except for the fact that the religious beliefs in some instance, would not permit some of the faith leaders to connect up with that one. Mm-hmm. So the strategy that has emerged on the basis of the discussion with the community is that we will all focus on the theme, what can stakeholders, including faith leaders, do to help us to eliminate the AIDS epidemic by 2030. That is the end of the sustainable. Okay. And that engagement has been very reasonable because faith communities are now coming up and they've done tremendous work in this area, not only in AIDS but in health. And they're coming up with the suggestions for reconciling the differences. So I give that as an illustration of how a regional thrust with the help of the faith communities could bear fruit.
Karl, you mentioned the point about FDI, foreign direct investment, and the need not to depend on it.
Yeah, well, that's something that we in the center, we have this a point we have been making, for years. When I heard the young lady speak, it really struck a chord because, you see, we have had a history in this region of external support coming in at crucial times. But what has become, well, I think what has happened to us, we have become sort of addicted almost to this kind of support. There is not in the region an attitude, well, look, we have the resources. We have shown on many occasions, take like Trinidad and Tobago. We have a GDP of 180 billion. Now 1% of that is nearly $2 billion. Now, so if you, why can't we decide we're going to allocate 1% of our GDP to deal with some of the problems that for example, the young lady spoke about. The support for our NGOs, for example, could come in that very easily. There's so much we can do if we are prepared to pay for the things that are important to us. I always find it a difficult thing when people say that AIDS is a terrible thing, this is a terrible thing, but somehow there's an unwillingness for us to pay, to invest in getting rid of it. And that kind of attitude is something I think we in the region have to think about. We are grateful for the external support. There's no question about that. But we have to stop seeing external support as crucial to what we have to do in this region. What we have to do, we have the capability to do it, and as a people, we have to say, okay, it is our problem. We are going to invest in dealing with it. I think it is an attitude that we have to start building up in the region.
James, you wanted to comment on the issue of mental health as well as the issue of faith-based organizations?
Thanks. I think faith-based organizations play a vital role. I remember Barbados 2008, Jamaica 2010, Suriname a couple of years ago, having meetings with faith-based groups, particularly around the subject of non-communicable diseases. And in doing research on that, I looked at the biblical basis for healthy living. I was really surprised. I mean, you're a Christian. Not everybody here is a Christian. And you don't realize the Bible is very clear on certain things. If you're slothful and lazy, your bones will break and go. If you're an alcoholic, you will live on the street in rags. How true? If you're gluttony, and so on. So these prescriptions for healthy living are actually in the manual of the Christian church, and very similar in the Quran and very similar in the Hindu writings. In Suriname, I recall having the whole interreligious organization, talking to them, and they said, you know, we need government, but this problem we face, boy, we run half the schools and the mosques and the temples and the churches, we could start there. And that was a very positive starting within the region. On the issue of health and the definition, Brendan, throughout the challenge, it is often framed physically, but health is a resource for living. That's the simplest definition I can think of, a resource for living. And therefore, you need to be physically, mentally, socially, and you could argue spiritually healthy. If you quote scripture again, there's a bit of scripture that says, Jesus grew in stature and in wisdom and in favor in the eyes of God and man. That's a paraphrase for physical, mental, social, and spiritual good health. And I use that when I think of my children and how, and my grandchildren, I'm hoping for, that they will grow up in that way as a resource for living. So those are the last comment on investment within the region. Karl and I were speaking to the Social Security directors the 6th of July of this year, and they are very worried. They're worried because with the demographic shift, there are fewer people who are paying contributions. They're worried because the benefits they're paying out due to NCDs in particular are increasing. And they're worried because the return on investment for their capital is low. And so the discussion was and they have a sense that a lot of this is preventable. Their mandate is not to prevent it. Their mandate is to collect contributions and pay benefits. But they have a sense that this can't continue. It's not sustainable. They're worried about the sustainability of Social Security. So we were making the argument, he and I conspired beforehand, on the NCDs and the implications for the labor force and social sustainability of Social Security labor market. And they accepted that. And you began to get a dialogue that, wait a minute, we Social Security should invest a little bit of what we have to prevent some of this carnage, and it'll be good for our bottom line in due course. And that dialogue we really need to get going further.
Okay. Karl, you want to ask about the university appointments?
Yeah, Brendan's point about, I think the point he was making was that the way how we are engaged as staff in UE does not open us to do the kinds of things I am saying that we should be doing. I agree with him, but my attitude has always been that when you know something is the right thing to do, you have to find a way to do it. And I think we just have to be creative. The UE statutes and whatever could say whatever they say. The fact is we live in a region here where if we as a university don't make a certain kind of contribution, it will be to our detriment. And those of us who work here have to find ways to do the thing that we know is the right thing to do. Go out there and help them to solve their problems. That's what we have to do.
A couple of points. I'm not as au fait with the scripture as James is, obviously not. But one additional point I'd like to make, in this part of the world, as many other parts of the world, the faith-based organizations are responsible for a tremendous amount of services, of health services, tremendous amount of health services. The last point I'm making this is that in relationship to universities as a whole, everybody now in the academic world will tell, not only academic world, you look at how the Nobel Prizes are awarded now, the emphasis is really on involving disciplines, various disciplines in solution of significant problems. And many of the health problems that we address can only be solved if there is interchange among the various disciplines. And this is one almost of the canons now of every good academic institution, every good research center, every good group really now is speaking about how can you facilitate this interaction among the various disciplines. Please.
Thank you. Kennedy Roberts from St. George's University in Grenada, and I have to say one of the non-biological sons of Professor Theodore, because as a young economist 25 years ago, he was very influential in me getting into health economics, and I am proud always to say that he has been one of the major contributors to my life. And what added to it, when I realized his wife was a pumpkin vine family from Grenada, I just said, you know, it's more than just a son, but almost close to a biological one. I want to start by saying, too, that Dr. Theodore's leadership at UE, at the Center for Health Economics, is what some of the leadership we need at the country level to get things done. And I think his statement yesterday that the Center for Health Economics does not depend on the university per se for a lot of its resources is an indication that what he's doing there needs to be emulated at the country level. The reality, though, is that we have a lot of evidence. In the issue of national health insurance, for example, we've spent a lot of years pulling together reports and presenting evidence. However, it has not translated into implementation as much as we would have liked. How can we use information, not waiting to do more and more studies to get 100% of information, but how can we use the information we have to really get certain things implemented? Because I'm convinced unless we can remove paying for health services at the point of delivery, unless we remove that, we will be continuing to talk about problems in the health systems and inability to access care. How can we get countries to implement some of the recommendations that we've been talking about for years and years and years?
Okay.
And the second component, what approaches, though, can we use to get the population more involved? Dr. Hospedales, you made reference to the whole use of all of society approaches. In addition to the cell phones, what sort of mechanism can we use to really get our people on the ground more involved, not necessarily to think at health per se, but healthy lifestyles that can improve our health status?
Thank you very much, Kennedy.
Okay, thank you. My name is John Felix. The area that I wanted to just comment on was the question of Sir George Alleyne early when he spoke about preventive medicine and the employment situation.
And the
Employment. For example, when the oil companies were here, and then we had companies like Karl Limited, Tate and Lyle, these companies had health offices on their compound. And each one of those companies had sporting facilities, which allowed for a sort of preventative approach to health and remaining healthy. But for instance, the Public Service of Trinidad and Tobago, there is not a health plan. So there are employees out there who have not had the opportunity to get some of the preventative approaches that are used in the private sector. I remembered fighting with an insurance company to include PSA tests for men. And some of the various
Include what?
type, the
PSAs
tests,
for men?
PSA, for the,
Did they include it?
yeah, they finally included after grade 5.
Pity, useless.
You know, and then they had the ladies who they didn't want to introduce some of the preventative mechanisms with regard to the tests that were necessary for them to determine, for example, pap smears and that sort of thing. Okay. And another area that I want to comment on is the question of the MDGs. I worked in a ministry, and when I talked about the MDGs, nobody knew about MDGs. They had a book somewhere on the MDGs, and they finally gave me the book. What I think that is necessary is that the strategic plans for these ministries should be used in order to set up the mechanisms for the MDGs so that they can be put in there, they can be measured, and have a robust monitoring and evaluation system with good indicators. Because what I find is that the indicators that are being used in Trinidad and Tobago, particularly where my experience is, as you go to each organization, the indicators differ.
Okay. Thanks very much. Only one, I apologize for making my comment, but just I happen to be reading a lot about the PSAs now. Everybody agrees it's pretty useless, actually.
That's in the recent times, yeah.
Yeah. But I applaud your efforts for use of a proper use of indicators. Now, this is a thorny problem always. How do you get the translation of information and evidence into action? That has been studied from. Do you have any insights into this, the three of you?
If I can say that there are two things that I have seen from my own experience and for when to get things implemented. There's the approach that I call the World Bank approach, where they would come, there would be a study, there would be ideas and suggestions. But the bank usually also brings some resources to get things started. And I think that is something we have to think about. Whenever we think about getting something off the ground, we also have to start thinking about, okay, what resources we need to get it started. I think in many cases we do a lot of studies, we reach the end of the day, and at the end, then we say, well, okay, well, then we start thinking about it. I think the thinking about resources has to be done at the start. But you know, the second thing that I've seen, again from personal experience, is that I think what happens in some cases is that studies are done, but the issue of trust, and let me put this well, I think when a country has to implement something on a recommendation from anybody, there has to be an element of trust. They have to have a sense that this person recommends them really had their interest at heart, and there is something about the work that they could link up with. Now, we have seen that. I mean, and in cases where you just do the reports, but there is not an attempt to build that relationship of trust between the person doing the report and the country, I find you tend to have, the countries tend to be slow. But where we have had definitely, I could tell you about cases where we have certainly had within our center where it was that relationship that we built up with the leadership in the different parts of the countries. And I think that relationship that we built up was the basis upon which they took what we said and did.
Ed, do you have any comment to make on that?
I just wanted to point, oh, sir. Yes, I just wanted to point to two things. One, I think we have the template for doing that. One of the speakers referred to the MDGs. Well, in fact, what the MDGs had, although they were ad hoc, but a series of targets for action. And what it did was generated a spirit of competition among regions and countries. And in fact, when you look at this, I'm just going to quote two statistics. We in the Caribbean, we achieved the goal reducing child mortality overall, really, in the hemisphere. 66% we increased the death rate to children, and we had a 42% decline in maternal mortality. And in fact, when we went to education, we even exceeded the targets. Now, I'm saying that is because we had some measurable things. But I want to turn to the future, because the past is in the past, and we have to build on on our experience and the lessons learned. And I think that we have a good template in what is recommended in the Sustainable Development Goals. I come back to that because investments in development will, throughout the world now, the global system, would relate to what we do in the Sustainable Development Goal. And if we think of our health goal in the Sustainable Goal 5, what we will see is that we have 9 targets for measuring. And that provides us here in the region with some guidelines of how we can relate to things that we have done. For example, the Caribbean Cooperation and Health, the Port of Spain Declaration, which Sir George led through his study. We had about 15 actionable recommendations in one and 10 in the other. How do we combine that so that, in fact, what we do is include monitoring and evaluation as we go along and be able to convert programs and declarations into actions? I think the template is a good one, and I want to say that here is where our institutions within the university could jolt us by doing continuous assessments of how we develop along the line of implementing our declarations.
James?
Thanks. Some comments on that, how to implement. As you said, the evidence on many things has been there for a long time. In medicine, the discovery delivery gap is 7 years. In public health, it is 20 to 30 years. And one of my missions in life is to shorten that. And I think the scholarship points to a number of things that are important, that the evidence is necessary but not sufficient. You have to package it to speak to people's heads, their hearts, and their pockets. We need champions for certain things. We must have civil society engagement. Most of the major changes in policy take place in part because people put pressure. The research shouldn't be to demonstrate that the problem is a problem, is a problem, is a problem. We need more political and policy-relevant research. What is the political feasibility of what we're talking about? What are the barriers to the uptake of the evidence which we have? How to package that evidence? What are the costs? What is the return on investment? We need structures through which things will be implemented. Eddie touched on targets, accountability. Accountability architecture is also needed in how we must have finance, and we must figure out how to keep it high on the agenda, which goes back to civil society, the advocacy to keep things high on the agenda. Some of this was used when we had the summit of CARICOM heads on the 4th of November last year, the special summit on Ebola and chikungunya, to craft a 10-point action plan that have many of these elements in it: funding, structure, accountability architecture. One of my disappointments was we thought we were very clever. We put into the resolution that the heads would review this again in February, just gone, and their thing in July. And the heads, to my surprise, they didn't honor that commitment. Once the problem declined, they didn't bother to honor the commitment that they made. So we need pressure in society that drives policymakers to honor the commitments that they've made as part of how we're going to implement.
Thanks. It's a very important question. I'm not going to get into that. I've spent a large part of my professional life dealing with this issue and agonizing about it and seeing what are the ingredients for it. I'm not going to get into it now. Yes, Dr. Poon-King.
Yeah, Dr. Poon-King, I'm from Trinidad and Tobago. I'm a consultant in public health. I have 2 questions. One comment Sir George made in tying up the discussion was the premise initially was that we have poor development, which has led to poor health, and he suggested it was the other way around. So my question was, is it that because health has not been central to the development process, we've been essentially spinning top in mud, as the Trinidadians say in going? And if so, how do you propose getting that top out of the mud onto solid ground? So that was one. And then the other comment was in relation to retailing. We do part process in retailing to the community, different issues, health issues. When I was small, I know not that long ago, the conversation about CARICOM and the institutions, the universities, essential to the process in getting things done or started. So you have both civil society and the institutions. That conversation was within civil society. I mean, I remember my parents talking about it. I find that happens very little now. And the question was, is it that in retailing, we also need to be able to retail these institutions and what they do so it's common, it's common talk in the population. Oh, CARICOM is doing this. How can we get them to, take this on board so that the civil society works at both ends, both from the bottom and the top? Yeah.
Thanks very much.
How would you do that?
The last comment here, I'm afraid we have to end at 10:35.
Thank you. Amalia del Riego from Pajo. I have three questions, sorry.
You need to come closer to the microphone, Amalia.
Maybe I'm a little short.
You can't correct that now.
No, but I'm in a very equitable position now.
All right.
Thank you, and thank for the discussion. It's been very rich. Three questions. One, under that phrase of leaving no one behind of the new sustainable development agenda, what can be strategic interventions to actually provide a holistic approach as we move in terms of countries planning in relation to the targets so that perhaps the planning is not taken vertically to, for example, we deal with obesity for children, but children are also affected by sexual violence, by violence in general. How we deal with a holistic approach in that. And specifically, what is your opinion in terms of a very vulnerable population that oftentimes is not mentioned in the list of priorities and perhaps may require a regional approach, which is the migrant population, specifically illegal migrants. Is all around the world the debate. Is there anything that needs to be done at the regional level in the Caribbean for that? The second question is, do we need a special approach or a different approach to deal with how we move toward this development agenda with the small island states? And the third question is there any space at the moment to, based on the framework, provide a little bit of thought about re-engineering the regional response so that the response can reach or improve efficiencies and perhaps looking at sustainability of the regional response?
Thanks very much, Nanda. Now, we run out of time. I'm going to give each one of you gentlemen a minute and a half to sum up and also to comment on these three things you heard. Shall we start with you, James?
Thanks to George. I'm not sure regional response to what, re-engineering, but which was the last thing I heard. But to pick up on the one with children, I think a more holistic approach is needed. If you look at the PAHO data on the school health surveys, it really is a big cause for concern. High levels of drinking, boys and girls, and being drunk in the last month, suicidal ideation, their sexual behavior, the amount of sitting down, besides school, sitting down several hours every day. So I think a more holistic approach is needed there to engage education, to engage parents in the dialogue of how to move forward.
Eddie?
Yes, I just want to pitch it to the university. And I would say that when I listen to all the questions, it seems to me that we have, as we go forward in this post-2015 era, and the intellectual research driving to data, that initiative, which I think the university could drive, we might have to see our work really as investment in more interdisciplinary scientific work, especially in the context of health and sustainable development. And that would mean that that interdisciplinary engagement would have to involve indicators of poverty, investing in poverty, creating the basis for involving and leaving no one behind, which the vulnerable groups, and linking with the other issues related to the environment, because that's what the Sustainable Development Goals are about. I come back to that because I think that is going to be in the vanguard, so to speak, of any principles and practices that we have to move forward with in this era.
Karl?
No, I think I just wanted to say that, you know, I think we, as a university, we have to understand that this is a period when all the countries in the region are struggling to get on board what they call universal health coverage, universal access to care. Now, this is something that it will demand that the health system be run in a more efficient basis, and and that equity will be central to what we do. Now, these things are not going to happen except the university. I think the UE, the different departments, different aspects of the different sections, that you have to get on board this question of universal health, because it is something that is central to. If we don't get that right, I think the development of the region is going to be in trouble. The health of the population is going to be central to what happens in our economies, and that is something that we have to understand. If we don't ensure that the population is kept healthy, our economies are going to suffer. And in that respect, I think UE has to get on board universal health. To me, there is no question about it. We have to get.
Well, let me thank, I'm sorry we couldn't take any more questions. Let me thank all you very much for your, let me thank the three. Let's have a round of applause for these three gentlemen. And next time, I promise you, there'll be two ladies among them. I think we answered, there was a lot of discussion. I think everyone would leave from here as, if not convinced, at least sensitive to the idea that health has a component of human development. And I'm going to ask everyone here to put his right hand on his heart and say, never to use the word development without an adjective again. Development without a qualification is contextually neutral. We're talking about animal development, cockroaches development, what kind of development we are talking about. So we should qualify development we are talking about. And so I'm going to ask us to avoid, and one of the reasons why I'm sensitive to this is that 20 years ago, the development specialists were all economists because development was seen only in terms of economic growth. And now we know that that is passé. It is no longer so. It is not that economic development is not important, but it's not the only things by which men and women live. So I'm going to ask you to not use the word development without qualifying it again. The penultimate point I would make is there's a very fundamental question was asked about evidence in development. And this is has occupied people for a long period of time. And I think James made the point very well. Evidence is necessary, but is not sufficient. And many of us techies are arrogant in thinking that because we produce data, it will be acted upon. That is arrogance in the extreme. People who have to take decisions have other considerations besides the evidence that we present. And many times we are not aware of the considerations or the constraints in which they act. And sometimes we say, oh, they are wicked, they are venal, they are corrupt, they're not, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It is not true. It is just that the constraints in which they operate are sometimes those that we do not understand. I understand very well the political constraints under which many of our leaders operate, and present to them evidence by itself and believe that they're going to act upon it because it comes from the fountain of truth and knowledge doesn't make any difference at all. There are different ways of doing it. And I've learned through the years that perhaps one of the critical areas is how you frame that evidence that you present. All of us have utility functions which we serve. And the utility functions of the decision makers may not be ours. It doesn't mean that they're wrong or they're right. They're just different utility functions. And the last point I'd make is this is the last. The last point I'd make is that when we spoke about, I posed to my colleagues the interaction of health as part of the social strand. I think they alluded to many aspects of it. One of the aspects which I will mention, which was not mentioned, is the gender aspect. We need to appreciate that health in relationship to gender inequality is terribly important. And we cannot continue to think of health only in relationship to the universe as a whole and not think of the extent to which there is differential impact, influence in terms of gender. So that is one aspect of the social strand of which you must never be unaware. Aspect of health on the environmental strand, which James mentioned, it is very difficult to show the direct impact. It can be, but it's not as easy with the social or economic strands. But we can show, obviously, that the environment impacts on health. I mean, from the time of Herodotus, not Herodotus, I forgot my Greek. We've known that Hippocrates, we've known of the airs and waters and the influence on health. We've known that. It is the other way around, the impact of health on the environment. As James said, this is one of the areas of great interest now. And finally, I will underscore the point that Eddie Greene made about let us take seriously the Sustainable Development Goals. Let us look at them, analyze them, dissect them, and see the extent to which we as a region can move forward as rapidly in the Sustainable Development Goals as we did in the Millennium Development Goals. And all of our countries are not march at the same rhythm. Amalia's point is critical. In many of the smaller states, there are going to be differences of opportunity and differences of the instruments that are raised. That doesn't mean that as a group, we don't have to take them into consideration. And of course, I'm going to be jingoistic and say the university as an institution has a really, really critical role to play in this whole area. So thank you all very much. And let us congratulate Professor Theodore again.